and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. Today, we commemorate the inauguration of the 47th President, Donald Trump, after the longest and most tumultuous year in recent memory in terms of politics and foreign policy. The results of the 2024 election in November, largely predicted by my two guests today, were still a surprise in a way that no one could have guessed what a seismic shift there would be in the political and social landscape afterwards. Where the 2016 election of Donald Trump brought on a wave of protest, including the landmark Women's March, which brought over 450,000 demonstrators to the nation's capital ahead of his first inauguration, the one that took place on Saturday drew only a few thousand. Original protesters contacted by Politico in recent days said there was a mixture of fatigue and frustration within their activist ranks, that the feeling of righteousness was just not there. One organizer of the 2017 event told Politico that she was, quote, not that type of progressive anymore, and was frustrated at what she views as a political left that is completely cannibalizing itself, end quote. Mainstream media outlets like CNN, MSNBC, and the Washington Post seem to be fitting that bill too, cannibalizing and or imploding. Instead of lashing out to find boogeymen like Putin and Xi Jinping as having engineered the election, the progressive left and even Democratic Party members have turned quite introspective. So what does this mean for foreign policy? Well, this week saw the incoming Trump administration get credit for the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, while the Biden team struggled against the optics of protesters at every media appearance. There seems to be more acknowledgement than ever that the only way the Ukraine war will come to an end is through negotiations, and the incoming White House and Trump cabinet nominees seem more in line with that one issue than any other in the foreign policy portfolio. But are there fissures in MAGA? Are they already emerging? This week, it was reported that Steve Bannon, new right impresario who actually did time in prison defending Trump, called Elon Musk, who has been at Trump's right hand for months through the election and after, an evil person. Where can we expect the fractures in the base to open, and what does that portend for an effective overall political strategy from the man at the top? Will that bleed into foreign policy and national security? Here to talk with me about all of this are my friends and two of the best political analysts I know, political writer and commentator Jack Hunter and Charles McElwee, reporter and editor for Real Clear, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show, guys.
Great to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to ask both of you. You heard the quote from the former Women's March organizer that she was, quote, not that kind of progressive anymore. Are you surprised that we are not seeing greater demonstrations against Donald Trump this time around, that the resistance seems to have lost its mojo? I'll start with you, Jack.
I'm not surprised that it's smaller, that it's as small as it is. I'm not really surprised, but to gauge these sort of things is always interesting to me. I mean, in 2016, you people thought Hitler was coming in, right? If you hated Donald Trump, that's what was going on. They've been saying this throughout. And a lot of Americans didn't know what to expect. And, you know, he was such an unconventional president. Well, we know what it looks like. And in 2024, you've got a Democratic president that, boy, you voted for in 2020 because you couldn't have another 4 years of Trump. And the biggest issues as Biden heads out the door for the last, for the last 15 months is fire, pro-Palestinian protesters wanting a ceasefire. What's going to happen with TikTok on the day? I know we're talking about foreign policy, but what are you protesting? If you're against Trump, who just got you the ceasefire, I'm talking about for progressives on the left and people like the one you quoted, what are you mad at? If you see what I'm saying, you can still think this guy's Hitler or whatever you want to imagine he is, but like, where's the proof in the pudding? I think there's three kinds of people on the left today, sort of your centrist, Democratic, average Democratic voter type that really doesn't like Donald Trump, but doesn't know how to answer some of what I just said as it relates to foreign policy. You really don't know what to say. If he gets something done on Ukraine and Russia, which I think will be a much longer process than what happened with Gaza, and that's still in the works too. Like, none of this is final, but he did something, whereas Biden and Harris administration did nothing. There's another kind of progressive, I think, and they're a minority, and some of these people are friends, liberals, I would call them, actual liberals, who are like, I didn't like the guy either, but ceasefire was the top of my list in foreign policy, and you got to hand it to him. You got that
Yep.
kind of person. And then you got a sort of far left identity politics sort of person who wants a ceasefire, but it's also about their gender identity and all this kind of stuff. And they're not going to just like anything he does, even if it's something good like a ceasefire. I think those are sort of the three categories of people on the left. What does that look like on a march the day before the inauguration or the weekend before? I think we saw what it looked like. It's that mismatch. They're demoralized.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, I voted for Trump this time. It was the first time I ever voted for the guy, and it was precisely because of issues like war and peace and things like that. But I think it's just a different team coming in 2024. Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth, what's going on with Elon Musk and all that's a different thing from 2016. And I think that's reflected in the left reaction to it or lack of.
Do you agree with that, Charles? I mean, I know throughout the entire campaign, we were told that a Trump win would be the death knell of democracy. The rhetoric hadn't changed much from 2016. If anything, they saw him more as a threat and were predicting a fascist takeover. I mean, Kamala Harris actually said that in one of the debates, that he would bring in fascism and fascist team members and embrace fascists abroad. But yet we're not really seeing a reaction to that in terms of like, we're not seeing a proportionate reaction to what the actual threat was being defined as during the campaign. What do you make of that?
Yeah, Kelly, I mean, all that rhetoric from last year about the threats to democracy, fascism, etc., it could be chalked up as a lot of dialogue from like the theater of the absurd in hindsight. And if anything, the Republican Party, for the first time in my lifetime, my sense is that it's a party that actually understands the zeitgeist. And I was born in '89, a few months after HW was sworn in. I mean, so in the span of 35 years, I mean, just following politics from childhood onward, that it really feels like this is the first time in my lifetime that the party has a pulse on the electorate. And it certainly shows with what Trump did, which was he replayed the 2016 playbook: foreign policy, trade, immigration, and it sold. It not only brought back the base, but it brought back a few more in suburbia, but also this new coalition of minorities who acutely understand the consequences of what has occurred in this country. Let's just say in the past 20 years. I mean, it was back in January 05, Kelly, that George W. Bush gave his inaugural address, which was viewed widely at the time as quite delusional, that he proclaimed that the calling of this nation was to spread liberty abroad. And at that time, a lot of the people who were even Democrats then were deeply concerned about the Republican Party's position then on immigration, trade, and foreign policy. And in many ways, the Democratic Party has taken hold of those issues. And we saw the consequences in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, of course. But it's kind of like the second wave. It brings to mind, like in the 80s, in places like Canarsie in Brooklyn, you had Jewish and Italian middle-class voters flock to Reagan. You had Macomb County, the most famous example in Michigan, the land of Reagan Democrats. And then this time, this election, we saw places like my family's hometown of Hazleton, nearly 70% Latino. Every single ward went for Trump. So all that talk about democracy, fascism, it was all fatuous, and the GOP prevailed with their sense of the zeitgeist.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when you see the data in black and white, that voters from every every demographic went for Trump, you can't turn around and say somehow this was just a white male thing, that this was Putin and a Russian influence operation. I think that has a lot to do with it, that the makeup of the vote and his victory shielded him from these attacks, that he wasn't representative of the entire electorate, that there was something more nefarious going on. I have a question for you, Charles, that I was going to save to the end, but since you brought up Pennsylvania, let's talk about this big debate within MAGA over the HB1 visas, which I believe was at the core of Bannon's lashing out at Elon this week. The big tech support for Trump, which was massive, and I think key to his fundraising this year, wants to keep the HB1s, which allow companies to bring in skilled workers from overseas, intact. But then there's this other contingent within MAGA that believes parsing out the visa issue is a betrayal of Trump's posture on America First and immigration. You saw what a drubbing Vivek Ramaswamy got from an X post, and where he seemed to suggest that Americans were suffering from mediocrity on the education and skills front, and that it was largely the fault of parental upbringing. Charles, how are these debates going down in the working and middle classes, which form the stronghold of Trump's base, particularly in places like Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think Pennsylvania definitely will be the laboratory for understanding how these policy debates play out and how they resonate among an electorate like Pennsylvania's, that you have a lot of working class majority regions, but plenty of prosperous suburbs too. And that's really the division outside of the rural counties of Pennsylvania, working class municipalities touching upon some of the wealthiest communities on the East Coast. So when it comes to immigration, yeah, this is a state, in some instances, cities that experience the fastest rates of demographic change over the course of 25 years, going back to the year 2000, especially like in the Lehigh Valley, northeastern Pennsylvania. And those are working class voters who, including Latinos, who are deeply concerned about immigration, the border. But I think where this H-1B fight comes in, this is also a state that when you go outside those working class regions where the warehousing and logistics sector prevails, you have a huge state when it comes to the life sciences and higher education, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, but all these communities in between, that higher ed is the top employer oftentimes. And yeah, they have skilled immigrants working in these communities, working for the pharma companies, et cetera. So Pennsylvania, when it comes to that immigration fight, on both sides, when it comes to the Trump White House, Pennsylvania is the state to follow to see which side prevails.
That's a really good point, Charles. I wanted to ask Jack, kind of on the flip side of this, you've done a lot of your writing and reporting and political activity within the libertarian orbit.
Sure.
And they differ sharply with MAGA on this issue in terms of, or at least the pro-immigration or anti-immigration, I don't know what you want to call it, faction of MAGA in terms of the HB1 visas. And HB1 visas are sort of like the symbol or the microcosm of that greater debate between the libertarian right and you would call the maybe traditional paleo-conservative right over immigration and bringing in skilled workers and the immigration issue writ large. Can you talk a little bit about how this might be playing out?
Kelly, I think you can read my mind sometimes and what I'm about to say. And maybe it's just because we're both libertarians, but I wrote a piece for the American Conservative in 2020 when Biden won about the possibilities for a libertarian populism post-Trump. And part of that was a multiracial coalition and where that might lead based on what happened in 2020, what the future might bring if another figure came about. And what you were saying, Charles, what you saw in Pennsylvania, he got a lot more minority voters, talking about racial minorities, than he did before, records for a Republican, also ideologically with independents. I mean, there are a lot of people who voted for Barack Obama who voted for Donald Trump. There are a lot of people who voted for Bernie Sanders in a primary who later voted for Donald Trump. So there's something a little different than just hard left and right. To your question, Kelly, one of the reasons I voted for the guy this time, and I didn't in 2016, there's Trump himself and what he says and does, and then there's the ancillary things that happen around him that attach themselves to Trump. So in 2016, it was hardcore anti-immigration, not just border security. We don't like immigrants. That was a big thing in 2016. I'm not saying Trump was that way. That's you could, maybe some people would see it that way, but there
Yeah.
were definitely people around him who were like that. Steve Bannon would have been like that, talking about the H-1B issue. And also like the national conservatism, the biggest reason I didn't vote for him, the alt-right stuff that was sort of happening at the time, and they attached themselves to Trump. In 2024, it's a hell of a lot more libertarian than what was going on in 2016. The H-1B visa thing, when that came about, Vivek said what he said, Elon Musk heralded the program, and Donald Trump ultimately heralded the program too, which is what a more libertarian-leaning conservative or Republican voter, somebody who would vote Republican, might say. I would add to that, you've had these national conservatism conferences where they want to do like a right-wing version of the New Deal and all this big government stuff, and Trump's the guy. And we got a Doge department going on right now that's going to look to radically cut government. I don't think that's exactly what Sohrab Ahmari had in mind when he was writing some of the things he wrote over the last 2 or 3 years, not to pick on him specifically. But to your point, Kelly, I think we're in a much more libertarian place. I think from a foreign policy perspective, it's going to be better. And Trump has said this, and people around Trump, RFK Jr. included, have said he learned. Like this time around, he might not hire John Bolton because he learned from the first time around, if you see what I'm saying, and not having those kind of people in his orbit. So I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about everything, but particularly this president. I'm not a fool. This is not going to go perfect. There can be plenty of things that happen that I don't like, including in foreign policy. But I'm very optimistic about prospects for real change and in a more libertarian direction, things we might like to see, or I might like to see for sure.
Yeah, it's absolutely a mixed bag because many of the financial, economic, trade nominations and appointments he's made are very anti-China, pro-tariffs, which
Sure.
I would imagine is not really where the libertarians want to go on some of the issues. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. We're going to have to see how it plays out. There's some hopeful signs for I guess, everybody. That's how I've been describing it over the last week, that it's such a mixed bag that you can find a little glimmer of hope in every appointment and nominee. And I know that that's not absolutely satisfying for those who probably had a more purist vision, but you know what? His coalition is diverse in itself. And so we can't expect it to be all for paleocons, all for libertarians, all for national conservatives, and in Republican Party stalwarts. It's going to be a little bit for everybody. Well, let me ask about, okay, we've talked about the H-1B1, HB1 visas. Let's maybe talk a little bit more about foreign policy and national security. Jack, do you have any sense of whether or not Pete Hegseth is going to clear the hurdles? Like, have you heard anything about whether or not his hearings this week have resulted in getting him some more support from the Republicans that he needs to break the logjam? Should he? I mean, so many of the Democratic questioners focused on his views on women in combat and his personal indiscretions, but what about his qualifications? And isn't all of his talk about building a more lethal force, a dog whistle to the service chiefs and the industry, that he's prepared to give them more or less the status quo in terms of budget and acquisitions? Is he allowing himself to be set up to get rolled over like every other Secretary of Defense? What are your thoughts on Pete Hegseth?
Well, obviously, we're all speculating here. Let's go back to something we were talking about earlier about, I was mentioning that the left is sort of demoralized, like they don't even know what they stand for anymore. And those hearings for Pete Hegseth, it was, are you a drunk? Are you a good husband or son or what? It was personal stuff. There was a time when Democrats would have been like, would you restart the Iraq war? Do you think that's a good idea? How's the Patriot Act for you? Are you cool with that? Like stuff like that. It was none of that because they don't even know where they are anymore. I'm not saying centrist Democrats aren't huge warmongers. They are, but something. It was all personal stuff. As far as what Pete Hegseth's going to do, he was a rock star in those hearings. He came out looking fantastic, just to the average person who paid attention to any of that stuff. He sounds an America Voice message, and I find that hopeful. When they ask him about things like Ukraine, he's not like, oh, we're going to keep giving them money and they're going to win. No, it's more realistic. It's America first. And I think ultimately, I think you saw this with Marco Rubio too. His answers on Ukraine about the Ukraine can't win, we got to bring this to an end. And that's not Marco Rubio from 15 years ago. It's just not. So I think Pete Hegseth and Rubio and people like that are going to do what their boss wants done. And I think they were chosen because they have some sort of sense of this or expertise, but also they're going to do what he wants. That's what I think is going to happen. And I'm hopeful about that, because I think what he wants broadly, there's going to be some things we don't like, is certainly preferable than what could have happened under Kamala Harris and what has happened under Biden.
Charles, what about his ultimately his qualifications? It does seem like he has the right spirit, as Jack pointed out. But once you get into an office or an agency which oversees, I think, like 800,000 daily employees, and probably more than that when you build in the contractors and whatnot. I mean, does he have what it takes to sort of stand up to the service chiefs, to stand up to the military industrial complex, which really just wants what it wants, like immediately, and will fight, resist, and push until it gets it? Does his lack of qualifications put him in a situation where he might not be able to do all the things that he wants to do, which is kind of to shake up the military system?
Right. It remains to be seen, because as you delineated, he has a tremendous task ahead of him. And it was really that, as I referenced earlier, that second inaugural address that George W. Bush gave, that military industrial complex was exploding at that time. That the Department of Homeland Security, for example, became the largest government agency or department. Northern Virginia became this vast suburban like wasteland for contractors and everyone who moved there, the bureaucrats for defense. So Hegseth would be up against that. And it is a tremendous job and undertaking, because there is an expectation that there's no, there's a full understanding that Trump's base, plus what his expanded coalition this election, shares the original Trump 16 view on foreign entanglements. The fact that we should not be fighting these frivolous wars abroad. And the Democrats took the Bush era approach in this race. I mean, it was comical. Like here in Pennsylvania, the Harris campaign had Christine Baranski, who's known as a Polish American actress, knock on doors in old Polish communities in Pennsylvania to say, keep the fight in Ukraine. And these older residents looked at her like she was crazy, because it's still in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania where military service is revered, and people understand the gravity of war. People aren't hawks. That's a misperception. The only hawks you find these days are in suburbia, where they're unaffected by the consequences. So Hegseth, to be clear, it remains to be seen, but considering how this has expanded since 20 years ago, a tremendous task ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you get a sense from Pennsylvanians, and I keep going back to Pennsylvania just because that's where you are in your reporting, but also it played such a key role in electing Donald Trump. There's a debate, within the realism and restraint community in which I operate, of whether or not, this vote or the election itself was a mandate on foreign policy for Trump. Do you get a sense that that's what Pennsylvanians were voting on when they went to the polls on November 5th, or is that being kind of blown up a little bit now in hindsight?
It was part of the package. No, they definitely factored it in, that the talk about Ukraine, for example, on the Democratic side was viewed as outrageous. I mean, it was here where in Scranton, for example, Governor Josh Shapiro was signing his autograph on artillery shells to be sent to Ukraine. And I can assure you, just spending such extensive time there, locals were appalled by that move, because, again, people understand the gravity of war. It's not placating. You drive through these communities and you see the banners on the main streets, and they're revering the older vets who served their hometowns. So there's no sense of hawkishness. And there wasn't a sense of hawkishness 20 years ago when these were all solid Democrat towns. They voted for Obama for a reason, and they voted for Trump for a reason. And that's why this is the land of the Obama, the Trump voter.
Jack, it does seem like the world leaders are lining up to work with Trump this time around, or at the very least that they're holding back on any resistance language so far. If anything, like Canada, for example, they're scrambling for what comes next, whether it be tariffs or sanctions or whatever. What do you think are Trump's biggest openings on the foreign policy front, and where do you see him actually hitting a brick wall?
Well, once again, we're speculating. I will say this, and to pick up on what Charles said a little bit, Barack Obama, people don't usually vote on foreign policy, American voters. That's rare. But sometimes it comes to a head where they do. It's part of the equation. When Barack Obama won in 2008, he ran as an anti-war candidate. People were sick of the Iraq war. There were so many military families directly affected by it. Everybody knew it was a bust. Nothing was happening. And also 9/11 happened, and that was the justice we got for it, this mess. So Obama was able to do that. Donald Trump winning in 2024, every week here's 60 billion more to Ukraine. Here's another billion. Oh, what about Hurricane Helene? We're going to do something about that one. Not as much as we're doing to Ukraine. I think that affected voters. It's like, what are you doing for us at home? As far as where he might hit a wall or do whatever foreign policy wise, when Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer that Trump tapped to go over and speak to the Israelis, went over there, and people are like, why is this real estate guy going on? I thought of my late father. He would joke, he was an electrical contractor. He liked Trump. He was like, our president's a contractor like me, like a construction contractor. He just goes in there and gets it done and doesn't care about all the, the bells and whistles and all the things you're supposed to do as a diplomat. And that's kind of what happened with Steve Witkoff, right? I think that's going to be Trump's style. I think people who don't like the guy are going to be like, look at this baboon and how he operates. Well, that baboon hired a real estate guy. That Steve Witkoff is not Rex Tillerson. Those are two very different people and how they operate. And he went over there and they said, Netanyahu can't make it. He's like, well, too bad. He's going to. And he made it. I think Trump, to the degree he operates like that and gets what's good for our interest from an America First perspective, I got a lot of hope for that. Where's he going to hit the wall? Maybe that, blows back on him in some way. But I admire that. And I think most Americans looking at it, if they're seeing the talking heads on TV or the DC experts saying like, oh, dear Lord, that's terrible. You would operate that. They're like, man, about time. Somebody's doing something for real and being serious about it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask my last question. And this relates, I guess, to the inauguration and all of the good press or positive press that Trump has been getting. And let's face it, I mean, compared to the campaign where, like we said before, the press was basically calling him a fascist on the march. Things have toned down quite a bit. So if we're seeing this as a sort of bizarre honeymoon period, what do you think will spell the end? The first press conference that Trump gives, the series of executive orders, particular on immigration that he's expected to sign. Where do you see the honeymoon ending, Charles? If at all, we'll just put that out there.
No, I mean, I think we're in for like a vertigo-inducing week. Hard to answer, but I think going into this, to bring it back to what I said initially, the sense of the zeitgeist, the press will have a harder time going on the attack like it did when Trump was inaugurated, like when he first came into office in 2017 compared to now, because his policy positions are so deeply popular. So let's say, on immigration alone, it remains to be seen exactly how these executive orders will look, but it must not be discounted that however this is carried out, there's deep popularity for those positions, and that's why he's going to be president this week.
That's a great point, Charles. Jack?
I don't know when the honeymoon will end, if it will, as you mentioned. I get the sense that this is sort of like, Ronald Reagan won in 1980, and they said he was Hitler too, and a fascist and all this, and in 84 he won even bigger. And it was part, I was a child during that era. It was part of how it made the country feel. I think that's what a lot of voters do. Yes, they vote on issues, but it's how it makes them feel. They didn't really feel comfortable or safe or secure, certainly not economically, under Biden in a way that they expected once they beat this Trump guy. Like, Trump looked better in retrospect. I could see 4 years of Trump and people saying, man, I wish we had him for another 4 years, but that J.D. Vance, but I could see that. Hey, George H.W. Bush won because people like Reagan. And then that ended. Then they happened to like Bill Clinton. I think the Clinton era was another era like that, where people, sex scandals aside, people felt good about that era where the country was. I think Trump could be that, and that's how we got to where we are in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, you can't say enough about zeitgeist and feeling. Honestly, I was a child during the Reagan period, and it wasn't until I went to college that I realized so many had hated him on the
Right.
left and in the elite circles of the American population. I grew up in a working class town in central Connecticut. My father was a hard hat Democrat, Reagan Democrat, and still is. And so I grew up with that feeling that you mentioned,
Yeah.
Jack, about feeling good about your country, and it sort of it was pervasive throughout. So when he had gotten shot, I mean, I had just been reading for the first time about John F. Kennedy assassination. My heart went right through my throat. I was a little girl, and I was like, "What's going on?" I mean, there was a real pall, at least from my perspective, because he was beloved. And like I said, it wasn't until I sort of expanded my worldview or went into college and saw that people hadn't really thought of Reagan that way, but they had been sort of, they had, they didn't prevail in a
Right.
sense that they weren't able to control his legacy in that way. And so perhaps we're looking at something similar today. Like Charles mentioned, the zeitgeist is in his favor. You, Jack, the emotional response to him is in his favor. So we'll see. Exciting times ahead, and I hope both of you will come back on the show and talk more specifically as we see policies roll out and responses to them. But I really appreciate your analysis. It's very sharp, and I know the audience does as well.
Thank you so much.